Welcome to Urban Connections, a show about the urban environment and its impacts on people's physical and mental health. I'm David Falk, your host this week. On today's show, we talk to Dr. Brendan Boyd, an associate professor of political science at MacEwan University in Edmonton, whose area of expertise and research is public policy, public administration, and climate change policy.
Dr. Boyd has had some discussions and experiences with different types of influential climate change policies among the Canadian provinces. But let's put things at a bit of a more local scale and discuss the climate action change here in Edmonton. ETS, Edmonton Transit Service, one of Edmonton's leading transportation systems, hosting over 80 million rides a year. Now, busing has already been known as an effective method for carbon emission reduction. The less cars on the road, the less carbon emission in our atmosphere. But now, Edmonton is taking it one step further by transitioning to electric buses. With over 60 buses in its fleet already, ETS has already said that they, quote, remain highly committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, providing more sustainable transportation, and improving the rider experience. But while electric buses have had a positive impact on our environment and the fight against climate change, are they really a reliable source for transportation in Edmonton's climate?
So I'm Dr. Brendan Boyd, and I'm Associate Professor in Political Science at MacEwan University.
How long have you been here?
I've been here since 2018, so 6 years.
What brought you here?
Just the job. I was doing a postdoc at University of Calgary, and then was on the market applying, and got this one.
What's urban wellness to you?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I think is interesting about the term urban wellness is it doesn't necessarily think about urban issues as things that can necessarily be solved all the time, but it really thinks about making life better for people in an urban setting. So what makes people well? Not necessarily solving homelessness, not solving the climate crisis, although these are things that we might want to work towards. But in a more immediate sense, what makes people well on a day-to-day basis, and how can we contribute to that, whether it's in research or whether it's in government policy or whatever it is. So I like the approach of wellness in the sense that it focuses on what makes people's lives better day to day. And what that means is that wellness is different for each person, and you really have to talk to the people in an urban setting to figure out what makes them well.
And your work mainly focuses on work on wellness within policy, correct?
Yeah, so I study public administration and public policy, a lot of basically what governments do and how, so in that context, how governments can contribute, and their decision making contributes to urban wellness. And so government can be a force that obviously can contribute to wellness for people in an urban setting, but government policies, government institutions can also be something that can have a negative impact on people's wellness. So I really like to think about not even one particular issue around wellness, but thinking about the processes of making decisions. How do we collectively make decisions about the actions that we take that government takes to contribute to wellness? How do we reconcile different conflicting interests, right? People will have different versions of what wellness means. People will have different interests within that context that they're trying to promote. How do we resolve those differences in a way that everyone can accept and move forward and live together?
Do you have an example of a meaningful piece of legislation that has contributed or detracted?
Well, I think everyone will be aware of the over the last winter, the encampments and the decision that the Edmonton Police Service made to sweep encampments and remove them. And so that's an issue where I'm not as interested in sort of figuring out, I guess I'm interested in the process, right, as opposed to having a particular opinion. And investigating different people's sort of stances on this. You had one side saying that this was necessary, this would improve safety, and that they would connect these people to services, but the encampments weren't working. Whereas you had other people that were saying, this is inhumane because people have set up a community, it's taking away the resources that they've put together for themselves, and it's not, building policy and responses from the ground up, taking into perspective the lived experience of the people in this area. So to me, that was a really interesting one where you had different people defining urban wellness differently, right? In one case, it was about downtown safety and security and people feeling safe downtown. Whereas I think the other approach was thinking about, the social conditions of the people living downtown and what was best for them. So, yeah, that's a policy where, I think what I'm interested in is when people have those very different perspectives, and it's not so much about debating what's the best response to an issue, but they actually don't see eye to eye on what the issue is, right? They define the issue differently. And so how can you have a constructive conversation about what the solution to an issue is if you're speaking a different language, essentially, right? If you're talking about a completely different way to frame the issue and what this issue is about and what's important.
Well, you define that as cross-jurisdictional learning, correct?
Cross-jurisdictional learning specifically would be about how jurisdictions learn from each other, right? So a lot of governments, policy analysts, when they have capacity, what they do is, the first thing that they do is they look around and see what's going on in other jurisdictions, right? You'll hear public servants, people in government say all the time, we don't want to reinvent the wheel, right? What they don't want to be doing is starting something new when someone has learned a lot about a particular issue or a particular response to an issue. And so in that context, governments are always looking at their peers, right? Looking around. So Edmonton will be looking at Vancouver, be looking at Toronto, be looking at other cities, maybe even in the United States, to see how they handled encampments, right, as an issue, for example. So that type of framing issue where people have different views, I don't think that necessarily relates to cross-jurisdictional learning, but within the context of that, for sure, everyone is always looking at other jurisdictions to see how they've handled the issue, whether it's to look for solutions, what works best, or to look for arguments that supports their opinion or their framing of the issue.
Do carbon taxes encourage investment? Because they seem to imply that if they were to follow the Trudeau-mandated government policies with it, then that encourages investment because it implies stability.
It can be, for sure. What the research shows is that usually jurisdictions don't want to go first. They don't like to be leaders. In a lot of cases, particularly mid-sized jurisdictions that aren't the largest and sort of the trendsetters, I guess, what they often like to do is have someone go first, figure out the mistakes, the pitfalls, what went wrong. Was it unpopular? Did it not work the way they thought it was going to work? And then they can come in and be part of, sort of the second wave of people that aren't falling behind, but they're not taking in sort of the risks of going first. And then you have sort of the laggards, right, who come along and are sort of pulled along because everyone else is doing it. They're getting a lot of flack, either domestically or externally from other jurisdictions. And so is that the case for Alberta today on climate? I would say that it was more the case under the NDP and even the PC party before, where, there was this concern about Alberta's reputation as a way to continue to have Alberta be a supplier to the U.S., potentially to other jurisdictions, but it was about, we need to ensure that people don't continue to associate the oil sands with high greenhouse gas emissions, tailing ponds, those types of things, right? And so taking climate action is a way to kind of improve that reputation. I think now there's a little bit more pushback on that, and that I think the sense is that we don't necessarily, there's a lot more pushback to the federal government specifically, obviously, under this provincial government. But there's more of a sense of, we've done a lot already, or we're doing a lot. We need to tell that story, but we don't want to be chasing around the favor of other jurisdictions. That people should want, understand that Alberta's been doing a lot, and and that they don't want to necessarily follow around just for the reputation. I think they're a little bit more willing to say, I don't know, that Alberta oil sands is the way it is, and you're going to take it or leave it.
It's the identity.
Yeah. So identity is a big part of it, because we do get associated, we use caricatures and stereotypes, right, to understand complex policy issues, different policy actors, those types of things. And so Alberta has been its own version of how it characterizes itself, and of course other jurisdictions have their version of how they characterize Alberta. But if you want to be a competitive oil producer and oil exporter in this market, you need to be doing something on climate change. I think the big thing is that certain conservative party like the UCP would say we've done enough, or we're doing a lot, and we don't need to go any further, whereas other parties would say, well, no, we need to keep doing more to make sure that we have that reputation as a leader.
I mean, this is kind of a tangent too, but it goes into like urban wellness as well. Do you think there's actually like a real chance that if you say Poilievre wins the next federal election that they're going to axe the tax like he's promising?
Yeah,
I assume that encourages investment because there's stability.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that the carbon tax does is it sends a price signal, right? It's covering an externality of the greenhouse gas emissions that are produced by certain activities. And so it's designed to move people, shift the economy towards particular modes of production that produce less carbon. So whether it would increase investment is one question. I don't know if that's guaranteed, but what it would do is shift investment. It would shift investment from, say, whether it's coal or oil and gas, like fossil fuel production, to cleaner forms of energy, because you would be paying the carbon tax, so it makes them more competitive or more economically viable. Whether that would expand overall, that's an empirical question that would have to be studied, I think.
What's the alternative if it's scrapped? Like, what does that look like for an individual consumer if we don't have a carbon tax anymore? Because I assume there is going to be an alternative policy. But we're seeing with Scott Moe in Saskatchewan, he came up with his own policy, and that cost more than the federal mandated carbon tax.
I think there's no way that he couldn't if he gets elected, because he's made it the pillar of everything that all of his messaging, right? He's calling for a carbon tax election.
Right.
And so if he wins, I don't think there's any way that he wouldn't get rid of it because of the political fallout of going back on that, right? Like if you make a promise somewhere in your platform on page 5, page 6, right, and you don't follow through on it, you might get away with that, right? Maybe some groups who are particularly invested would say like, hey, why didn't you do this, right? But the average general public would be like, oh, well, we didn't read the platform, like we voted for another reason. So they wouldn't necessarily know whether you went back on your promise or not. It would be hard to be held accountable. But when you clearly link like the election itself, your party, the election to the carbon tax, there's really no way to do anything else. Like you couldn't back out of it.
What do you mean by technologies? Can you define that, and how would that help in for anybody that lives within an urban setting?
Yeah, so that's the issue. Economists will tell you that carbon tax is the least costly way to reduce emissions, because what it does is it doesn't pick winners and losers. It doesn't overinvest in any sector of the economy. What it does is it says, here's the price signal. This is what it should cost if you include the greenhouse gas emissions, the cost of carbon, essentially. And then it says the market will sort out the rest, right? And so that leads to, if you follow that line of reasoning, that leads to the most efficient outcome. So the alternatives would likely cost more, but one of the things is we also have a tax on industry as well. We have a consumer carbon tax, which is largely what Poilievre is talking about. When he talks about the industrial carbon tax, he hasn't said that he would get rid of that. So I wrote a piece maybe about a year ago talking about the possibility of, if the consumer carbon tax is gone, how much and how possible would it be to expand the industrial tax to try to make up for that, because of course you could include it in fuel use, which would then cover, right, like vehicles, and if you could ramp up the cost of it, because it's lower, but if you could ramp up the cost, would you be able to make up that difference? I think it would be pretty hard to do. You'd have to really increase that price on industry. But outside of that, there's lots of things that could be done. Largely the Conservative government at the federal level has talked about technology and said, well, we don't want to charge people, we don't want to create a cost for people, but what we want to do is we want to invest in technology so that people can find better ways to reduce emissions in their production. The thing that I always say, or that I always think about that, is of course that costs money, right? It's one thing to say like, let's focus on technology, but of course you're going to have to provide funding, you're going to have to provide investment to support that. If that's your policy, where's that going to come from? It's going to come from some kind of tax, right? And so if you look at the public support for different options of what would you do with the money from a carbon tax, the rebates or the tax cuts, right, that is usually what's associated with it, right? So BC did a tax cut where they reduced personal income taxes and those types of things to kind of offset the balance of having a carbon tax. What the federal government did was provide rebate checks. You get a check. First it was once a year in your tax returns, then it was quarterly to make sure people knew it was coming and it showed up in your bank statement. But what most people actually support is investing a carbon tax in technology. So my argument or my solution to this would be like, if we're going to focus on technology, why don't we keep the carbon tax and put all that money into technology? And so all the revenue that comes from a carbon tax actually goes to a technology fund that would then go to companies, industry, small business, those places that want to reduce their emissions. Whether that, maybe I'm being optimistic, but I wonder if that would, based on some of the data that I've seen, I wonder if that actually might be more politically viable than actually the tax cuts, because people don't seem to know that they're getting the tax cuts or don't believe that they're getting the rebates. And that becomes a problem because that whole argument that we're making you whole overall while reducing your emissions doesn't seem to be landing with people.
Is Edmonton doing okay with our investment within the public transit? Because we need to be we used to be the envy of every kind of small town, mid-sized city, but now we're very, very, very far behind in our investment.
The problem is just the money, right? The money, the city council is very much in a budgetary pressure where, they've had some funding cuts from the provincial government in terms of infrastructure, those types of things. There's other, factors that play into that, but, they had to increase, I think it ended up being 8.9% property tax increase that they approved in the spring, I believe. And politically, that's just not viable. I don't think council's going to go there again with that big of an increase. And so there's just not money to invest. They are building public transit, right? The Valley Line West is happening. Valley Line East is operational. They're talking about, I think it's the Capital Line is the other, whatever the next one is the expansion of the Capital Line maybe. But there's only so much money. And I don't know if even all this, if they built everything that's planned, would that really move the needle? I don't know. I don't have, I haven't crunched any numbers on that, or I couldn't even crunch the numbers on that. But I just think that the level of infrastructure that you would need to actually really affect greenhouse gas emissions from cars is pretty big, and it would require a bigger investment than what we're kind of envisioning at this point, would be my sense.
Thanks for joining us on Urban Connections. This week's episode was produced by David Falk, Jackson Sugar, Ryan Johnson, Rihanna Yamini, and Jacob Doherty. The show was edited by Jacob Doherty. The show's supervising producer is Sheena Rossiter, and additional supervision by Sasha Stanovich. This episode was produced as part of BCSE 302 online content production course in the fall 2024 semester. The course is part of the Bachelor of Communication Studies program in the Department of Communications at MacEwan University. The show is a collaboration between the Department of Communication and the Research Institute for Urban Wellness at MacEwan University, out of the MacEwan Media Production Studio. Our theme music is called Creativity by Kaylee Lambert. Logo design for this podcast is by Sasha Stanovich. And I'm David Falk, your host for this week's episode. This podcast was recorded on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional and ancestral territory of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, and Nakota Sioux. We acknowledge that this territory is home to the Métis settlements and the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 9, 10, and 11, within the historical North Saskatchewan River Territory.